emergence of Prussia as the leading German power and the increasing unification of the German states were viewed with apprehension by Napoleon III after the Prussian victory in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The Prussian Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, at the same time deliberately encouraged the growing rift between Prussia and France in order to bring the states of southern Germany into the national union. He made sure of Russian, Italian, and British neutrality and prepared for war. The immediate pretext for war presented itself when the throne of Spain was offered to a prince of the House of Hohenzollern, Sigmaringen, a branch of the ruling house of Prussia. The offer, at first accepted by Bismarck's advice, was rejected after a strong French protest. But the aggressive French foreign minister, the Duc de Gramont, insisted on further Prussian assurances, which King William I of Prussia, later Emperor Wilhelm I, refused. Bismarck, by publishing the famous Ems dispatch, inflamed French feeling, and on July 19th, France declared war. Partly because they believed France the aggressor, the states of southern Germany enthusiastically joined the North German Confederation, just as Bismarck had hoped. The military conduct of the war was, for the Germans, in the hands of Helmut Karl Bernhard von Moltke, a military genius. On August 4, 1870, the Germans crossed the border into Alsace. They defeated the French in a series of decisive battles and began their march on Paris. In the course of these battles, Napoleon III and 100,000 of his men were captured at Sedan. When the news of Sedan reached Paris, a bloodless revolution occurred. Napoleon was deposed, and a provisional government of national defense was formed. Paris was surrounded by Germans on September 19th, and finally capitulated on January 28, 1871, after a grueling siege and several months of famine. In the war's aftermath, provision was made for the election of a French National Assembly, which met at Bordeaux. The Assembly accepted the peace agreement, which was formalized in the Treaty of Frankfurt and ratified on May 21, 1871. France agreed to pay an indemnity of $1 billion, and Alsace and a large part of Lorraine were ceded to Germany. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Germany was proclaimed an empire under Kaiser Wilhelm I. Besides establishing the Third French Republic and the German Empire, the Franco-Prussian War had other far-reaching effects. Desire for revenge guided French policy for the next half-century. Prussian militarism had triumphed and laid the groundwork for German imperialistic ventures. The Papal States, no longer protected by Napoleon III, were annexed by Italy, which thus completed its unification. These and other effects were links in the chain of causes that set off World War I. Baha'u'llah's second letter to Napoleon III, sent from the prison city of Akka, containing the prophetic warning of impending disaster and personal debasement, was received in 1869. In less than a year, the Emperor of the French was himself a prisoner and died in exile on January 9, 1873. The tablet addressed to Pope Pius IX was part of a larger collection of tablets to the monarchs called the Surah of the Temple, Surah-i Haikal, revealed in the latter days of Baha'u'llah's banishment to Adrianople and recast after his arrival in Akka on August 31, 1868. In those days, Pius IX was a temporal as well as a spiritual king. As with his fellow monarchs, however, he found himself caught up in the forces released by the Day of God. Baha'u'llah warns Pope Pius IX not to allow the veil of names to bar him from recognizing his Lord, who has appeared with a new name. He admonishes the Pope for living in palaces, while his Lord is confined in the most desolate of abodes. He counsels the pontiff to sell his possessions and expend them in the path of God, to abandon his kingdom unto the kings, in effect, to give up his temporal power, relinquish the Papal States, and concentrate on a spiritual ministry, proclaiming the principles of a new age. This would ultimately require the abrogation of many of the traditional institutions, doctrines, and practices of the Catholic Church, including monasticism, celibacy, confession of sins, and the priesthood itself. From the most great prison, Baha'u'llah issued his command. O Pope, rend the veils asunder. He who is the Lord of lords is come. He verily hath again come down from heaven, even as he came down from it the first time. Beware that thou dispute not with him, even as the Pharisees disputed with him without a clear token or proof. Dwellest thou in the palaces, whilst he who is the King of revelation liveth in the most desolate of abodes? Leave them unto such as desire them, and set thy face with joy and delight towards the kingdom. Tear asunder the veils of human learning, lest they hinder thee from him who is my name, the self-subsisting. Call thou in remembrance him who was the Spirit, who when he came, the most learned of his age, pronounced judgment against him in his own country, whilst he who was only a fisherman believed in him. Consider those who opposed the Son, when he came unto them with sovereignty and power. How many the Pharisees who were waiting to behold him, and were lamenting over their separation from him. And yet, when the fragrance of his coming was wafted over them, and his beauty was unveiled, they turned aside from him, and disputed with him. None save a very few, who were destitute of any power amongst men, turned towards his face. And yet today, every man endowed with power and invested with sovereignty prideth himself on his name. In like manner, consider how numerous in these days are the monks who in my name have secluded themselves in their churches, and who, when the appointed time was fulfilled, and we unveiled our beauty, knew us not, though they call upon me at eventide and at dawn. We behold them clinging to my name, yet veiled from myself. This verily is a strange thing. My body hath borne imprisonment, that your souls may be released from bondage. And we have consented to be abased, that ye may be exalted. The people of the Koran have risen against us, and tormented us with such a torment that the Holy Spirit lamented, and the thunder roared out, and the clouds wept over us. Though threatened by the swords of our enemies, we summon all mankind unto God, the fashioner of earth and heaven. Say, O peoples of the earth, scatter the idols of your vain imaginings in the name of your Lord, the all-glorious, the all-knowing, and turn ye unto him in this day, which God hath made the King of days. O Supreme Pontiff, incline thine ear unto that which the fashioner of mouldering bones counseleth thee, as voiced by him who is his most great name. Sell all the embellished ornaments thou dost possess, and expend them in the path of God. Abandon thy kingdom unto the kings, and emerge from thy habitation with thy face set towards the kingdom, and detached from the world. Then speak forth the praises of thy Lord betwixt earth and heaven. Pope Pius IX did none of these things. He did not acknowledge the station of Baha'u'llah, and had no intention of selling his treasures or relinquishing his temporal authority. Instead, the complex forces of social change, the shifting balance of political power in Europe, and the inexorable movement for the unification of the Italian nation all inescapable manifestations of the overpowering spirit of the age, ultimately compelled the Pope to do exactly what Baha'u'llah had counseled him to do voluntarily. The Papal States emerged as a sovereign political entity in the 6th century. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine government in Constantinople launched a reconquest of Italy that took decades and devastated the country. Just as those wars wound down, the Lombards, a pagan Germanic tribe from Scandinavia, entered the peninsula from the north and conquered much of the countryside. By the 7th century, Byzantine authority was largely limited to a diagonal band running roughly from Ravenna, where the emperor's representative, or exarch, was located, to Rome. The Bishop of Rome, as the largest landowner and most prestigious figure in Italy, began by default to take on much of the ruling authority that the Byzantines were unable to project to the area around the city of Rome. While the bishops of Rome, now beginning to be referred to as popes, remained de jure Byzantine subjects, in practice the Duchy of Rome became an independent state ruled by the Church. During the Renaissance, the papal territory expanded greatly, notably under Pope Alexander VI and Pope Julius II. The Pope became one of Italy's most important secular rulers, as well as the head of the Church. From 1305 to 1378, the Pope lived in Avignon, in what is now France, and were under the influence of the French kings. During this Avignon papacy, however, the Papal States in Italy remained formally under papal control. During this period, the city of Avignon itself was added to the Papal States. It remained a papal possession, even after the Pope's return to Rome, only passing back to France during the French Revolution. The French Revolution proved as disastrous for the temporal territories of the papacy as it was for the Catholic Church in general. With the fall of the Napoleonic system in 1814, the Papal States were restored. From 1814 until the death of Pope Gregory XVI in 1846, the popes followed a harshly reactionary policy in the Papal States. The city of Rome maintained the last Jewish ghetto in Western Europe. There were hopes that this would change when Pope Pius IX was elected to succeed Pope Gregory. Hailed as the liberal pope at his accession in 1846, Pope Pius IX turned intransigent after the 1848 revolution in Rome forced him into exile, and he returned to Rome with a decades-long condemnation of what he termed the modern world. He lost the Papal States to the forces of Italian unification, but was protected in Rome by the troops of French Emperor Napoleon III until those troops had to be pulled out to defend France against the Prussians in 1870, just after the First Vatican Council had proclaimed papal infallibility. Italian unification was an historical process by which the Kingdom of Sardinia gradually conquered the Italian peninsula, including the Papal States. The end of the Pope's temporal power was sealed when Count Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, and Napoleon III met at Plombières in July 1858, concerting plans for a combined war against Austria and the subsequent territorial extension of the Sardinian kingdom. They sent their agents into various cities of the Papal States to propagate the idea of a politically united Italy. The defeat of Austria at Magenta on the 4th of July 1859, and the subsequent withdrawal of the Austrian troops from the papal legations inaugurated the dissolution of the Papal States. The insurrection in some of the cities of the Romagna was put forth as a plea for annexing this province to Piedmont in September 1859. On the 6th of February 1860, Victor Emmanuel demanded the annexation of Umbria and the Marches, and when Pius IX resisted this demand, made ready to annex them by force. After defeating the papal army at Castelfidardo on the 18th of September and at Ancona on the 30th of September, he deprived the Pope of all his possessions, with the exception of Rome and the immediate vicinity. On the 17th of March, 1861, Victor Emmanuel II, King of Piedmont Sardinia, was proclaimed King of Italy by grace of God and the will of the people. Finally, on the 20th of September, 1870, he completed the annexation of the papal possessions by seizing Rome and making it the capital of a united Italy. The Pope's residence, the Quirinale Palace, became the royal palace of the kings of Italy, and Pius IX withdrew in protest into the Vatican, where he lived as a self-proclaimed prisoner of the Vatican until his death on February 7th, 1878. Ironically, Baha'u'llah, the prisoner of Akka, was released from his close confinement in the prison barracks in the ancient citadel of Akka on November 4th, 1870, just 2 months after the Pope himself became a prisoner in his own palace. And in June 1877, a few months before the passing of Pius IX, still a prisoner of the Vatican, Baha'u'llah finally departed the confines of the walled city of Akka for the verdant fields of Mazra'i nearby. It is even more ironic that in the exact year and month of the 100th anniversary of Baha'u'llah's declaration to the world, proclaiming that the sacred promise in all the holy books had been fulfilled, Pope John XXIII issued his encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, on April 11, 1963, which received worldwide acclaim. The praise was justified. Not only did the encyclical address many of the problems facing the world, but Pope John himself was a true lover of his fellow man, a saintly human being. In that encyclical, the Supreme Pontiff spoke about world peace, a world community, the search after truth, universal education, equality between men and women, the oneness of mankind, and the oneness of God. He spoke of the harmony of science and religion, advocated disarmament, and stressed the need for a spiritual solution to economic problems. These ideas sound very familiar to Baha'is, for they are one and all principles of the Baha'i faith. They are teachings and counsels which Baha'u'llah gave to the world over a century before the Pontiff finally gave official utterance to them, albeit without acknowledging their source. Pope John XXIII, because of his sincere love of humanity and his wise guidance to a troubled world, received the Nobel Prize for Peace. He was admired and lauded around the world. Yet he had no more than echoed the teachings of Baha'u'llah, whose reward was denunciation, scourging, chains, banishment, and imprisonment for nearly half a century. Alexander II was born April 29, 1818, in Moscow, and died March 13, 1881, in St. Petersburg. He was the son of Grand Duke Nikolai Pavlovich, who became Emperor Nicholas I in 1825, and Alexandra Fyodorovna, who, before her marriage to the Grand Duke and baptism into the Orthodox Church, had been the Princess Charlotte of Prussia. Alexander succeeded to the throne at the age of 36, following the death of his father, Nicholas I, in February 1855, at the height of the Crimean War. The war had revealed Russia's backwardness compared to the more advanced nations like England and France. Russian defeats which discredited the oppressive regime of Nicholas I, provoked a demand for change among Russia's educated elite. Under the impact of this widespread unrest, the Tsar embarked upon a series of reforms designed to bring Russia into line with the more advanced Western countries. A footnote may be in order here to remind us of the historical connections linking Baha'u'llah to these events. You'll recall that when Baha'u'llah was imprisoned in the Xxiii in August 1852, Prince Dolgorukov, who played a central role in Baha'u'llah's release, was a minister of Tsar Nicholas I. Baha'u'llah was 37 years old and living in Kurdistan at the time of Alexander II's succession to the throne at age 36. Alexander II played an active role in the legislative process that on February 19, 1861, culminated in the Emancipation Act. By a stroke of the autocrat's pen, tens of millions of serfs were given their personal freedom. However, the reform failed in its ultimate objective of creating an economically viable class of peasant proprietors and helped to undermine the already shaken economic foundations of Russia's landowners. Nevertheless, this and many other reforms started Russia on the path of modernization and release from feudalism. Notwithstanding these measures, it would be wrong to describe Alexander II as a liberal. He was in fact a firm upholder of autocratic principles, sincerely convinced both of his duty to maintain the God-given autocratic power he had inherited and to oppose constitutional or representative government. Contemporary politics only strengthened these convictions. The relaxation of Russian rule in Poland, for example, led to patriotic street demonstrations, attempted assassinations, and finally, in 1863, to a national uprising that was only suppressed with difficulty and under threat of Western intervention on behalf of the Poles. Even more serious, from the Tsar's point of view, was the spread of nihilistic doctrines among Russian youth, producing radical leaflets, secret societies, and the beginnings of a revolutionary movement. The government, after 1862, had reacted increasingly with repressive police measures. A climate was reached in the spring of 1866 when Dmitry Karakozov, a young revolutionary, attempted to kill the emperor. The attempt failed, but left its mark, completing his conversion to reactionary conservatism. For the next 8 years, the Tsar's leading minister, Pyotr Shuvalov, maintained his influence, at least in part, by frightening his master with real and imaginary dangers. The period of reaction following the assassination attempt coincided with a turning point in Alexander's personal life. An extramarital affair, which it was impossible to conceal, absorbed the Tsar's energies while weakening his authority both in his own family and in St. Petersburg society. His sense of guilt made him vulnerable to the pressures of the pan-Slav nationalists, who used the ailing and bigoted empress as their advocate when in 1876 Serbia became involved in war with the Ottoman Empire. Although decidedly a man of peace, Alexander became the reluctant champion of the oppressed Slav peoples, and in April 1877 finally declared war on Turkey.